I was standing in my backyard, watching $50,000 worth of copper piping and precision-crafted equipment get crushed into scrap metal when I realized the HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their miserable lives. My name is Connor Ashford, and I had been living in the Pleasant Ridge subdivision outside of Knoxville, Tennessee for 3 years when this nightmare started. I worked as a chemical engineer for a pharmaceutical company, decent money, quiet life, and I had a hobby that most people would consider unusual but was perfectly legal. I operated a licensed distillery on my property, not some backwoods moonshine operation. A legitimate, state-licensed, federally permitted craft distillery that produced small-batch bourbon and rye whiskey. The still itself was a beautiful piece of engineering. Custom-built copper pot still with a column attachment, temperature-controlled fermentation tanks, and a small barrel aging shed. I had invested years of research, thousands of dollars in equipment, and countless hours navigating the bureaucratic maze of federal and state alcohol regulations. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives had inspected my operation twice. The Tennessee Department of Revenue had my file thicker than a phone book. Everything was documented, licensed, and completely above board. I had set up the distillery in 2022, right after I bought the house. The property was just over an acre, which gave me plenty of space to work with. The still operation took up maybe a quarter of that space, tucked away behind my garage where it was barely visible from the street. I had even planted a row of evergreens along the property line for extra privacy, not because I had anything to hide, but because I knew some neighbors might not understand what I was doing. For the first 2 years, everything was fine. My immediate neighbors, the Williamson family to the left and old Mr. Patterson to the right, were actually fascinated by the operation. I'd given them both bottles of my first successful batch, a smooth, honey-colored bourbon that had won an honorable mention at a local spirits competition. Mr. Patterson, a retired Navy veteran, told me it was the best whiskey he had tasted since his grandfather's recipe back in the 50s. The problem started when Patricia Hendricks moved into the neighborhood. Patricia was exactly what you would picture when someone says the word Karen. Mid-40s, aggressively blonde hair cut in that speak-to-the-manager style, and the kind of permanent scowl that suggested she had been looking for things to complain about since birth. She had moved into the corner lot at the entrance of our subdivision, and within a week had appointed herself the de facto HOA enforcer. Now, Pleasant Ridge technically had an HOA, but it had been dormant for years. The original developer had set it up back in 2005, collected some dues for a few years, then basically abandoned it when the housing market crashed. The covenants existed on paper, but nobody enforced them. People painted their houses whatever color they wanted, parked boats in their driveways, and generally lived their lives without interference. It was one of the reasons I had bought here. Patricia changed all that within a month of moving in. She started by calling an emergency HOA meeting, which only about 15 people attended out of the 73 homes in the subdivision. Most of us had better things to do on a Tuesday night than listen to someone complain about neighborhood aesthetics. I did not go to that first meeting. I wish I had, because maybe I could have stopped what was coming. At that meeting, Patricia somehow got herself elected HOA president. The vote was 8-7, with most people not even knowing what they were voting for. She immediately began sending out violation notices. The Johnsons got cited for their basketball hoop being 6 inches too close to the street. The Ramirez family was told their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Mr. Patterson received a notice about his lawn being a 1/4 inch too tall, despite the fact that the man was 83 years old and did his best with a push mower. I received my first notice in October 2024. It was a formal letter printed on official-looking HOA letterhead that Patricia must have had made at an office supply store, informing me that my distillery equipment was in violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Neighborhood Covenants, which prohibited commercial business operations on residential property. I read the letter twice, checked the actual covenant documents that had come with my house purchase, and confirmed what I already knew. Section 7, Paragraph 3 did say that, but Section 7, Paragraph 4 specifically exempted hobby activities and small-scale craft operations that do not generate significant traffic or noise. My distillery qualified. I produced maybe 200 bottles a year, sold only through licensed retailers, and never had customers coming to my property. It was textbook hobbycraft operation. I wrote a polite response explaining this, attached copies of my federal and state licenses, and dropped it in Patricia's mailbox. I thought that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. 2 weeks later, I received another letter. This one was less polite. Patricia claimed that my interpretation of paragraph 4 was incorrect and that I needed to remove the distillery equipment within 30 days or face fines of $100 per day. The letter also threatened legal action and claimed that the HOA had the authority to enter my property and remove the equipment themselves if I did not comply. That was when I decided to get a lawyer. I called around and found an attorney named Marcus Fleming who specialized in HOA disputes. Marcus was a heavy-set guy in his 50s with a reputation for not taking crap from overreaching neighborhood associations. His office was in downtown Knoxville, a cramped second-floor space above a coffee shop that smelled perpetually of burnt espresso and old law books. "Let me get this straight," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair after I had explained the situation. "You have a federally licensed distillery, state licensed, all your permits are current, and this HOA president thinks she can just shut you down because she does not like it?" "That's about the size of it," I said. Marcus laughed, a deep rumbling sound that shook his whole body. "Mr. Ashford, this is going to be the easiest case I have handled all year. Federal law preempts HOA covenants when it comes to licensed activities. The supremacy clause is crystal clear on this. Not to mention, Tennessee state law explicitly protects licensed craft distillers. You could probably sue them for harassment at this point." "I do not want to sue anybody," I said. "I just want to be left alone to make my whiskey." "Then we will make that happen," Marcus said. "Let me draft a response. I will cite the relevant case law, explain why they have no legal standing, and strongly suggest they back off before this gets expensive for them." Marcus sent his letter the next day. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, 10 pages of citations and precedents that basically said the HOA could pound sand. I felt pretty good about things. Surely once Patricia understood she had no legal leg to stand on, she would move on to harassing someone else about their fence height or whatever. I should have known better. Patricia responded by calling the Knox County Zoning Department and filing a complaint that I was operating an illegal commercial facility. The zoning inspector, a bored-looking guy named Dave who had clearly seen this kind of petty neighbor dispute 1,000 times, came out to my property on a Wednesday afternoon in early November. "So where is this illegal factory I'm supposed to be investigating?" Dave asked, clipboard in hand. I showed him the distillery setup. He walked around it, took some photos, checked my permits, and made notes. "Yeah, this is all fine," he said after about 15 minutes. "You are zoned agricultural residential, which allows for small-scale production activities. Your permits are in order. Whoever called this in was wasting everyone's time." "That would be my HOA president," I said. Dave rolled his eyes. "Of course it is. You would not believe how many calls I get from HOA busybodies trying to use the county to settle their petty grudges. I will file this as unfounded and send them a letter saying as much." Patricia did not take that well. Over the next month, I received 3 more violation notices from the HOA, each one more aggressive than the last. The fines she threatened grew from $100 a day to $500. She claimed I was creating offensive odors, unsightly structures, and potential fire hazards. None of it was true. The distillery produced a pleasant, slightly sweet smell during fermentation that you could only detect if you were standing right next to the equipment. The structures were professional-grade stainless steel and copper, maintained to federal safety standards, and the fire risk was no greater than having a gas grill, which half the neighborhood had. I ignored the letters. Marcus had advised me that without a court order, the HOA could threaten all they wanted, but could not actually do anything. The fines were not enforceable because the violations were not real. Then December came, and I made a mistake. I had to fly to Chicago for a week-long conference related to my actual job, some new pharmaceutical processing techniques that my company wanted me to learn. I left on a Monday morning, planning to be back the following Sunday. While I was gone, Patricia struck. I got the call on Thursday afternoon. It was Mr. Patterson, and he sounded shaken. "Connor, you need to get back here," he said. "The HOA brought in a demolition crew. They're tearing up your distillery right now. I felt my stomach drop. What? They cannot do that. Did you call the police? I tried, Mr. Patterson said. They said it was a civil matter between you and the HOA. There is nothing they can do. I was on the next flight back to Knoxville. The entire trip was a blur of anxiety and rage. I kept trying to call Patricia, but she did not answer. I called Marcus, who was equally shocked. They cannot do this, Marcus kept saying. This is destruction of property. This is trespassing. I do not care what their covenants say. You cannot just demolish someone's legal business operation. Can you meet me at my house? I asked. I'm landing at 7 tonight. I will be there, Marcus said. I landed at Knoxville's McGee-Tyson Airport at 7:15, grabbed my bag, and drove straight home. It was dark by the time I pulled into my driveway, but the backyard was lit up with work lights. I could hear the sound of heavy machinery and men shouting. I ran around to the back of the house and stopped dead. My distillery was gone. Not just dismantled, but destroyed. The copper pot still, which had cost me $15,000, was crumpled and torn, lying in pieces on the ground. The fermentation tanks were crushed. The aging shed had been bulldozed into a pile of lumber. A massive yellow excavator sat in the middle of the wreckage, and 3 men in hard hats were loading debris into a dump truck. Patricia stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching the destruction with a satisfied smile. I lost it. What the hell do you think you are doing? I shouted, storming toward her. Patricia turned to me, and that smile never wavered. Enforcing HOA regulations, Mr. Ashford. You were given multiple opportunities to remove this eyesore yourself. Since you refused to comply, the association exercised its right to abate the violation. You had no right. My hands were shaking. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her understand what she had just destroyed. That was a licensed business operation. You just destroyed $50,000 worth of equipment. You should have thought about that before violating neighborhood covenants, Patricia said calmly. The HOA will bill you for the removal costs, of course. I estimate it will be around $8,000. One of the demolition workers approached Patricia, a clipboard in his hand. We're about done here, madam. Just need your signature. I grabbed the clipboard before Patricia could take it. The header said, Hendricks Demolition Services, with an address in Maryville. Is this your company? I asked Patricia. She snatched the clipboard back. My brother's company, not that it is any of your business. You hired your brother's demolition company to destroy my property, and you are charging me for it? I am charging you for code enforcement, Patricia said. Where the HOA chooses to source its contractors is not your concern. That was when Marcus Fleming's car pulled up. He took one look at the destruction, and his face went red. Mrs. Hendricks, he called out, walking toward us, I am Marcus Fleming, Mr. Ashford's attorney. What you have done here is criminal destruction of property. I am advising you right now to cease all activity and leave this property immediately. Patricia's smile faded slightly. This is a legitimate HOA enforcement action. We have the authority under the covenants. No, you do not, Marcus said flatly. Those covenants do not override federal licensing laws. You have just destroyed a federally permitted distillery, which means you have potentially committed a federal crime. I strongly suggest you leave before I call the FBI. The demolition workers heard that and immediately started packing up their tools. Patricia's brother, a heavy-set guy with a beard and a nervous expression, approached her. Trish, if this guy is federally licensed, we should not be here, he muttered. I did not sign up for federal charges. You are fine, Patricia snapped at him. These are just scare tactics. But the crew was already loading the excavator onto its trailer. Within 10 minutes, they were gone, leaving behind a wasteland of twisted metal and broken wood where my distillery had been. Marcus pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. Mr. Ashford, I need you to document everything here. Every piece of equipment, every receipt you have, every permit. We are going to bury them in litigation. I spent the next 2 hours photographing the destruction. The ruined copper, still, the crushed fermentation tanks, the shattered glass from the hydrometer and thermometer collection. Marcus helped me catalog everything, making notes on his phone. Tomorrow morning, we file 3 things, Marcus said as we finished up. First, a police report for destruction of property. Second, an emergency injunction to prevent the HOA from taking any further action. Third, a civil lawsuit for damages. And I am going to recommend you file a complaint with the TTB as well." "The TTB?" I asked. "The Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau," Marcus said, "the federal agency that licenses distilleries. What Patricia did was not just destroy your equipment. She interfered with a federally regulated business. The TTB takes that very seriously." I filed the police report the next morning at the Knox County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who took my statement looked increasingly concerned as I explained what had happened. "So this HOA president had your licensed distillery demolished while you were out of town," the deputy repeated, as if to make sure he had heard correctly. That is correct," I said. "I have photos, witness statements from my neighbor, and documentation of all my federal and state permits." "And she hired her own brother's company to do it?" "Yes," the deputy shook his head. "That's messed up, man. I will get this filed, but you should know that the DA is probably going to treat this as a civil matter unless there is clear criminal intent." "She trespassed on my property and destroyed $50,000 in equipment," I said. "How is that not criminal?" "I am not saying you are wrong," the deputy said carefully. "I am just saying that HOA disputes get complicated, but I will pass this along to the detectives and see what they say." The injunction hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Marcus and I showed up at the Knox County Courthouse with boxes of documentation. Patricia showed up with her own lawyer, a nervous young guy fresh out of law school who looked like he was regretting his career choices. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Judge Carolyn Morrison, listened to both sides for about 20 minutes before making her ruling. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Judge Morrison said, looking at Patricia's lawyer. "Your client authorized the demolition of a federally licensed distillery without a court order, without consent from the property owner, and using her brother's demolition company." Patricia's lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the HOA covenants give the association the right to abate violations when homeowners refuse to comply." "The covenants do not override federal law, Counselor," Judge Morrison said sharply. "Mr. Ashford's distillery was operating under federal and state licenses. Those licenses preempt any HOA covenant. I am granting the injunction. The HOA is hereby prohibited from taking any further enforcement action against Mr. Ashford's property without a court order. Additionally, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges." Patricia's face went pale. Her lawyer tried to argue, but Judge Morrison cut him off. "We are done here, Counselor. Your client made a serious error in judgment, and she is going to face the consequences." The civil lawsuit moved slower. These things always do. Marcus filed a complaint seeking full damages for the destroyed equipment, plus punitive damages for the willful destruction of property, plus attorney's fees. Patricia's lawyer filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the HOA had acted in good faith to enforce its covenants. That motion was denied. Then they tried to argue that my equipment was only worth scrap value. That argument fell apart when I produced receipts showing exactly what I had paid for each piece. But the real bombshell came from an unexpected direction. In January, I received a certified letter from the Tennessee Department of Revenue. I opened it with a sense of dread, assuming it was somehow related to the HOA mess. Instead, I found something completely different. The letter informed me that the Department of Revenue had opened an investigation into the destruction of my distillery. More specifically, they were investigating whether the destruction had resulted in a loss of tax revenue to the state. The letter requested that I contact Revenue Agent Sarah Kincaid to discuss the matter. I called Marcus immediately. "What does this mean? Why would the Revenue Department care about my distillery?" "Because you were producing taxable alcohol," Marcus said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "Connor, every gallon of spirits you produce is subject to state excise taxes. When Patricia destroyed your distillery, she did not just destroy your property. She destroyed the state's ability to collect taxes on your future production." "But I already paid taxes on everything I had produced," I said. "Right, but you had permits to produce a certain amount each year. The state expects that tax revenue. By destroying your means of production, Patricia interfered with state tax collection. That's a very serious issue in Tennessee." I called Agent Kincaid the next day. She asked me to come to the Department of Revenue office in Nashville for an interview. I drove up the following week, bringing Marcus with me. Agent Kincaid was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her office was functional and sparse, dominated by filing cabinets and a computer that looked like it had survived the Clinton administration. "Mr. Ashford, thank you for coming in," she said, shaking my hand. "I have been reviewing your file, and I need to understand exactly what happened to your distillery." I walked her through the entire story. The HOA notices, Patricia's harassment, the demolition while I was out of town. Agent Kincaid took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "And you had all the proper permits?" she asked. "Federal and state," I confirmed. "Everything current, all inspections passed." "What was your annual production?" "About 200 bottles per year," I said. "I was licensed for up to 500 gallons annually, but I never hit that limit. This was a hobby operation, not a commercial distillery." Agent Kincaid did some calculations on her computer. At 200 bottles per year, that is about 18 gallons of finished spirits. At Tennessee's excise tax rate, that comes out to roughly $400 in annual tax revenue. Small potatoes, you might think, but it adds up over time. "So what does this mean?" I asked. Agent Kincaid leaned back in her chair. "It means that Mrs. Hendricks interfered with the state's ability to collect lawful tax revenue. Under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 57-3203, it is a Class E felony to willfully interfere with the production of taxable alcohol. Now, that statute is usually applied to people who are trying to evade taxes, but the language is broad enough to cover what happened here." Marcus sat forward. "Are you saying the state is considering criminal charges against Patricia Hendricks?" "I'm saying that I am recommending the district attorney pursue charges," Agent Kincaid said. "But there is more to this than just the criminal aspect. Mr. Ashford, you were in compliance with all state regulations, correct?" "Absolutely," I said. "Then the state has an interest in making sure you can resume production," Agent Kincaid said. "You are a licensed taxpayer engaging in a lawful business activity. The state of Tennessee has a vested interest in protecting that activity. I'm going to recommend that the Department of Revenue file a formal complaint in support of your civil lawsuit." I sat there stunned. "The state is going to support my lawsuit?" "Not directly," Agent Kincaid explained, "but we can file an amicus brief explaining the state's interest in this matter. It carries weight. Judges listen when the Revenue Department says someone has interfered with tax collection." Over the next 2 months, things escalated quickly. The Knox County DA decided to bring criminal charges against Patricia after all. She was charged with felony destruction of property and interference with a licensed business. The charges related to tax interference that Agent Kincaid had mentioned were filed separately by the state. Patricia pleaded not guilty to everything. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had acted in good faith based on her understanding of the HOA covenants. The DA's response was brutal, pointing out that good faith does not include hiring your brother's demolition company to destroy someone's property while they are out of town. The civil trial was scheduled for April. As the date approached, Patricia's lawyer made several attempts to settle. First, they offered to pay for the scrap value of the destroyed equipment, about $5,000. Marcus laughed and countered with $150,000, which included the equipment value, lost production, emotional distress, and punitive damages. They came back with $25,000. Marcus held firm at $150,000. They went back and forth until we were sitting at $75,000 a week before trial. "Should I take it?" I asked Marcus. We were sitting in his office reviewing the settlement offer. "That is your call," Marcus said. $75,000 is decent money. It covers your equipment and then some. But I think we can win more at trial, especially with the Revenue Department backing us." "What are our chances?" I asked. Marcus shrugged. 80%? Maybe 90? The facts are on our side. The law is on our side. And Patricia made this incredibly easy by using her brother's company and demolishing everything while you were out of town. That shows premeditation. But you never know with juries." I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me wanted to take the money and be done with this nightmare. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 years building that distillery from nothing, wanted Patricia to face the full consequences of what she had done. "Let us go to trial," I said. The trial started on a Monday in late April. The courtroom was one of those old wood-paneled affairs that looked like it had been built in the 70s and not updated since. Judge Morrison presided, the same judge who had granted my injunction. Patricia sat at the defense table looking nervous, her young lawyer shuffling papers. Marcus and I sat at the plaintiff's table. Behind us in the gallery sat Mr. Patterson and several other neighbors from Pleasant Ridge who had grown tired of Patricia's HOA tyranny. Agent Kincaid from the Revenue Department sat in the back, there as an observer on behalf of the state. The trial took 3 days. Marcus methodically built the case, calling witness after witness. Mr. Patterson testified about watching the demolition happen. The zoning inspector testified that my distillery was completely compliant with county regulations. A federal TTB agent testified about the licensing requirements and confirmed that I had met all of them. Then Marcus called me to the stand. He walked me through the whole story again. How I had built the distillery, obtained the licenses, operated legally for years, how Patricia had started harassing me the moment she moved in, the violation notices, the escalating threats, the demolition while I was out of town. Mr. Ashford, can you describe what you felt when you saw your distillery had been destroyed? Marcus asked. I took a breath. This was the part I had been dreading, having to talk about the emotional impact. But the jury needed to hear it. I felt violated, I said. I had spent 3 years building that operation. Not just the money, but the time, the effort, the pride I took in doing everything correctly. I'd followed every regulation, gotten every permit, done everything by the book. And Patricia destroyed it all in an afternoon because she did not like how it looked. Patricia's lawyer tried to make me out to be some kind of scofflaw during cross-examination, suggesting that I had been operating an illegal moonshine operation. That backfired spectacularly when I calmly recited all my permit numbers from memory and explained the federal inspection process. The defense's case was weak. Patricia took the stand and tried to argue that she'd been acting in the best interest of the neighborhood. Marcus tore her apart on cross-examination. Mrs. Hendricks, did you hire your brother's company to demolish Mr. Ashford's distillery? Marcus asked. Yes, but that was just because he gave us a good rate, Patricia said. And you did not think there was a conflict of interest there? I do not see how. You do not see how hiring your brother's company using HOA funds to demolish another homeowner's property might be a conflict of interest? Patricia shifted uncomfortably. I was acting in accordance with the covenants. Marcus pulled out a thick document. Mrs. Hendricks, I have here the original Pleasant Ridge HOA covenants from 2005. Can you point me to the section that gives you the authority to demolish a federally licensed business operation without a court order? Patricia's lawyer objected, but Judge Morrison overruled him. Patricia fumbled through the document and could not find anything. That is because it does not exist, Marcus said. You acted on your own authority, without board approval, without a vote, and without any legal basis. And in doing so, you destroyed $50,000 in property. Is that correct? I was trying to protect property values, Patricia said weakly, by committing a felony. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, the foreman read the verdict. In the case of Ashford versus Hendricks, we find in favor of the plaintiff. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $53,000 for destroyed equipment and lost production. We award punitive damages in the amount of $100,000. We award attorney's fees in the amount of $32,000. I sat there stunned. $185,000 total. Patricia looked like she might faint, but the legal consequences were not over. The criminal trial was scheduled for June. Patricia faced 2 felony charges, and the DA was pushing hard for a conviction. I attended the criminal trial, though I was not directly involved. The DA's office called me as a witness, and I testified about the destruction and the impact it had on my business. The Revenue Department sent Agent Kincaid to testify about the tax implications. The criminal trial took a week. Patricia's defense was essentially the same as it had been in civil court, that she had been acting in good faith to enforce HOA rules. The jury did not buy it. They found her guilty of felony destruction of property. The tax interference charge was reduced to a misdemeanor after some plea negotiations, but she was convicted on that as well. Judge Morrison handled the sentencing. She was not sympathetic. Mrs. Hendricks, you took it upon yourself to act as judge, jury, and executioner in a neighborhood dispute, Judge Morrison said. You did not seek a court order, you did not follow proper procedures, and you used your position as HOA president to enrich your family's business while destroying another person's legal livelihood. This court takes such abuses of authority very seriously. Patricia was sentenced to 2 years in prison, suspended to 18 months of probation, plus 500 hours of community service. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of $185,000 from the civil judgment and permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in Tennessee. But the story does not end there. Remember how I mentioned that the Tennessee Department of Revenue had taken an interest in this case? Well, they took more than just an interest. They took action. In August, 6 months after the civil trial, I received another letter from Agent Kincaid. This one was much more pleasant than the first. It informed me that the Department of Revenue had completed its investigation and determined that I had been fully compliant with all state regulations. Furthermore, in recognition of the harm done to a law-abiding taxpayer, the department was offering me a 5-year tax exemption on my distillery production, up to 500 gallons annually. I called Agent Kincaid immediately. Is this for real? The state is giving me a tax break? Not exactly a tax break, Agent Kincaid said. More like restitution. The state failed to protect your operation from interference. This is our way of acknowledging that and making it right. You are still required to report production and maintain your licenses, but you will not owe excise taxes for 5 years. That is worth about $2,000, I calculated quickly. Actually, it is worth more than that, Agent Kincaid said. The department is also going to cover the cost of replacing your distillery equipment up to $50,000. We have a fund for situations where licensed businesses are harmed by illegal interference. Your case qualifies. I almost dropped the phone. The state is going to buy me a new still. The state is going to help you rebuild your legal tax-paying business, yes, Agent Kincaid said. You should receive the paperwork within a week. Once you submit receipts for new equipment, we will reimburse you. I hung up and immediately called Marcus. You are not going to believe this. Try me, Marcus said. At this point, nothing surprises me about this case. I told him about the tax exemption and the equipment reimbursement. Marcus laughed so hard I thought he might hurt himself. Connor, do you understand what just happened? The State Revenue Board just sided entirely with you. Not just sided with you, they are actively helping you rebuild. That never happens. I have been practicing law for 30 years, and I have never seen the Revenue Department go to bat for an individual taxpayer like this. Why did they do it? I asked. Because you are exactly the kind of taxpayer they want to protect, Marcus said. You followed every rule, paid every tax, did everything by the book. When Patricia destroyed your operation, she sent a message that it does not matter if you follow the law. The state could not let that stand. They made an example out of her and made a hero out of you. The insurance money and the state reimbursement arrived by September. I used it to build a new distillery, bigger and better than the first one. This time, I included security cameras covering every angle and a reinforced fence around the entire operation. I also got permits for a small tasting room, which the state approved enthusiastically. Patricia ended up having to sell her house to pay the civil judgment. She moved out of Pleasant Ridge in October, and nobody was sorry to see her go. The HOA dissolved shortly after, with most residents voting to simply abandon the covenants altogether. It turned out that once Patricia left, nobody else cared enough about mailbox colors and lawn heights to keep the organization going. Mr. Patterson came over the day I fired up the new still for the first time. I was running a test batch, making sure all the equipment worked properly. The copper pot gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the fermentation tanks hummed quietly in the background. It is good to see this up and running again, Mr. Patterson said, watching the condensation drip from the cooling coil. Place was not the same without it. Thanks for standing by me through all this, I said. Your testimony at the trial made a real difference. Mr. Patterson waved that off. I just told the truth. That woman was a menace and she needed to be stopped. I'm glad you fought back. I did not have much choice, I said. She destroyed my still. You had a choice, Mr. Patterson said seriously. You could have taken the easy way out, accepted the settlement, moved on. But you stood up for yourself and made sure she faced consequences. That matters. That means something. The new distillery produced its first batch of bourbon in November 2025. I aged it in small oak barrels, monitored the temperature religiously, and waited impatiently for the 3 months to pass before I could bottle it. When the time came, I filled 20 bottles of the smoothest bourbon I had ever made. I gave one to Mr. Patterson, one to Marcus Fleming, and one to Agent Kincaid. The rest I sold through a local liquor store that had been carrying my products for years. They sold out in 2 days. The liquor store owner called me excited. "Connor, whatever you did differently with this batch, keep doing it. I have people asking when you will have more." "I did not do anything different," I said. "Same recipe, same process." "Well, it tastes different. Better. Like you put something extra into it." Maybe I did, I thought. Maybe fighting for something makes it taste sweeter in the end. By December, I was back to full production. The new still could handle larger batches than the old one, which meant I could produce more without pushing the equipment. I stayed well within my license limits, but I was able to increase output to about 300 bottles a year. The local papers picked up the story eventually. "Local distiller wins big against HOA," ran in the Knoxville News Sentinel. "State Revenue Board sides with craft distiller in HOA dispute," was the headline in the Tennessee Journal. I even got a call from a local TV news station wanting to do a story, but I declined. I had never wanted attention. I just wanted to make whiskey in peace. The one interview I did agree to was with a trade magazine called Craft Spirits Quarterly. They wanted to talk about the legal issues facing small distillers, and my case had apparently become famous in the industry. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica, drove out to my place in January 2026. "So you are the guy who beat the HOA," Jessica said as I showed her around the distillery. "I would not say I beat them," I said. "More like they beat themselves by breaking the law." "But you fought back when a lot of people would have just given up," Jessica said. "That takes courage." "It took stubbornness," I corrected, "and a good lawyer, and a lot of luck." "Luck that the Revenue Department decided to back you?" "That was not luck," I admitted. "That was the system working the way it is supposed to. I had followed all the rules, paid all the taxes, done everything right. When someone destroyed my legal business, the state stepped in to protect it. That is not luck. That is what should happen." Jessica's article came out in March 2026. It was a long piece that detailed the entire saga, from Patricia's first violation notice to the criminal trial to the state's decision to help me rebuild. The magazine sent me a copy, and I put it on the shelf in my tasting room next to my licenses and permits. Business grew steadily through 2026. Word spread about the guy who had stood up to the HOA, and people wanted to try the whiskey at the center of the controversy. I raised my prices slightly to account for demand and invested in better barrels for aging. The quality improved with each batch. In April 2026, exactly 1 year after the civil trial, I entered a bottle of my bourbon in the Tennessee State Spirits Competition. It was the same competition where I had gotten an honorable mention years earlier. This time, I won first place in the small batch bourbon category. The award came with a ribbon, a certificate, and absolutely zero monetary prize, but it felt like winning the lottery. The judges' notes praised the smoothness, the balanced oak flavor, and the subtle honey notes. One judge wrote, "This is what craft bourbon should taste like." I framed the certificate and hung it in the tasting room. Mr. Patterson came over to see it, moving slowly with his cane but still sharp as ever. "First place," he said, studying the certificate. "Your grandfather would be proud." "I never told you about my grandfather," I said, surprised. "You did not have to," Mr. Patterson said. "Nobody puts this much effort into making whiskey unless they are honoring someone." "Who was he?" I smiled. He was a chemical engineer, like me. Worked for a pharmaceutical company his whole life. He always said that chemistry was just cooking for people who liked to measure things. He never made whiskey, but he always wanted to. He used to take me to distilleries when I was a kid, show me how they worked. He died before I could share any of my batches with him. "Then you are not making whiskey for you," Mr. Patterson said. "You are making it for him." "I guess I am," I said. Patricia Hendricks served out her probation without incident. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to Florida, probably to escape the embarrassment of what had happened. Her brother's demolition company faced fines from the state for participating in the illegal demolition, though he avoided criminal charges by cooperating with investigators. The Pleasant Ridge subdivision never reformed the HOA. A few residents tried to organize something in late 2026, but nobody wanted any part of it. The covenants technically still existed on paper, but they were never enforced. People painted their houses in whatever colors they wanted, parked RVs in their driveways, and put up basketball hoops wherever made sense. The subdivision looked a little less uniform than before, but it felt more like a real neighborhood. In June 2026, I hosted my first official tasting event at the distillery. Agent Kincaid had helped me get the permits, and the state had been surprisingly enthusiastic about the whole thing. 20 people showed up, paying $20 each for a flight of 4 whiskeys and a tour of the operation. I walked them through the process, from fermentation to distillation to aging. I explained how the copper pot still worked, how temperature control affected flavor, how barrel char influenced the final product. The guests asked intelligent questions, and I found myself enjoying the teaching aspect of it. At the end, we sat in the tasting room and sampled the whiskeys. I'd prepared 4 different batches, from my earliest successful run to the award-winning bourbon to 2 experimental recipes I was working on. "This one," a woman said, holding up the award winner, "this is exceptional. Why is not this available in stores?" "Limited production," I explained. "I can only make so much, and most of it is already spoken for by regular customers." "You should scale up," another guest suggested. "Get a bigger operation going." I thought about that. Maybe someday. But right now, this is exactly what I want. Small batches, high quality, no pressure. If I scale up, it stops being a hobby and starts being a job. I already have a job I like. "What do you do?" someone asked. "Chemical engineer for a pharmaceutical company," I said. "I work on drug manufacturing processes. This," I gestured at the distillery, "is what I do for fun." "Some hobby," the woman said, laughing. "Most people collect stamps or play golf." "I used to play golf," I said, "but whiskey is more satisfying." The tasting events became a regular thing. Once a month, I would host a small group, usually people who had heard about the story and wanted to see the distillery that had caused so much trouble. I kept the group small, never more than 20 people, and I always made sure to explain the legal side of things. The most important thing, I would tell them, is that this is completely legal. I have federal permits, state permits, county approval. I pay all my taxes, I follow all the regulations, and I do everything by the book. That is why I won when the HOA tried to shut me down. You cannot break the law to enforce what you think the law should be. People always nodded at that, understanding the broader point. Some of them had their own HOA horror stories, though none quite as dramatic as mine. I heard about fines for the wrong color curtains, demands to remove vegetable gardens, threats over holiday decorations. The HOA nightmare was apparently universal. Marcus Fleming came to one of the tasting events in August, bringing his wife and some friends. He sampled the whiskeys appreciatively and pulled me aside afterward. "You know, this case made my whole year," he said. "I've been practicing HOA law for 20 years, and I have seen some real abuses of power. But your case was special. We got justice, we got compensation, and we got criminal charges. That almost never happens." "I got lucky," I said. "Lucky that the state backed me up." "It was not luck," Marcus said, echoing what I had told the reporter months earlier. "You did everything right, and the system rewarded you for it. That is how it is supposed to work, even if it does not always work that way." "Have you heard anything about Patricia lately?" I asked. Marcus shook his head. "She dropped off the radar after moving to Florida. Still owes you most of the judgment, by the way. Her house sale covered about half of it, and she is supposedly making payments on the rest, but I would not hold your breath on seeing the full amount." "I do not need the money," I said. The state reimbursement and the insurance had more than covered my costs, and the distillery was generating modest profit now. I just wanted her to face consequences. "She did," Marcus said. "Criminal conviction, probation, community service, barred from ever serving on an HOA board again. Plus, the permanent stain on her reputation. I would say she faced plenty of consequences." By the fall of 2026, the distillery was running smoothly. I had settled into a comfortable rhythm of production, tasting events and regular sales. The award-winning bourbon had become my signature product, though I continued to experiment with different recipes and aging techniques. The Tennessee Department of Revenue sent me a letter in October, 2 years after the demolition, congratulating me on my continued compliance and thanking me for being a model licensed business. The letter also noted that I had generated over $5,000 in state tax revenue since rebuilding, which apparently made me a valued taxpayer in their eyes. I framed that letter too and hung it next to the competition award. Mr. Patterson came over to see it and laughed at the bureaucratic language. "They thanked you for paying taxes," he said, shaking his head. "What is the world coming to?" "They are thanking me for fighting to keep paying taxes," I corrected. "That is different." "I suppose it is," Mr. Patterson agreed. "Most people try to avoid taxes. You went to court to preserve your right to pay them." "When you put it that way, it sounds crazy," I said. It was crazy," Mr. Patterson said. "The whole thing was crazy, but you won, and that is what matters." In December 2026, I received a package from Agent Kincaid at the Revenue Department. Inside was a bottle of whiskey, not mine, but a premium Tennessee bourbon from one of the big distilleries. The note read, "Thank you for reminding us why we do this job. Happy holidays, Sarah Kincaid." I opened the bottle that night and shared it with Mr. Patterson on his front porch. It was a cold December evening, and we sat bundled in jackets watching the sunset over the subdivision. "So was it worth it?" Mr. Patterson asked. "The lawsuits, the stress, all of it?" I thought about that question for a long time. "Yeah," I finally said. "It was worth it, not because of the money or the recognition or any of that. It was worth it because somebody needed to stand up to Patricia and her abuse of power. If I had not fought back, she would have just moved on to the next person, the next violation, the next excuse to make someone's life miserable." "You did the neighborhood a favor," Mr. Patterson said. "Place is a lot quieter now." "Quieter and more colorful," I said, looking at the various house colors up and down the street. Without the HOA enforcing a limited palette, people had repainted in blues and greens and even one bright yellow house at the end of the block. "I like it better this way," Mr. Patterson said. "Feels like people actually live here now, not like some sterile subdivision." "Agreed," I said. We finished our drinks in comfortable silence, and I walked home as the stars came out. The distillery sat dark and quiet behind my house, the copper still visible through the window, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Tomorrow I would start a new batch, continuing the cycle that had nearly been destroyed 2 years earlier. In January 2027, more than 2 years after the demolition, I received the final payment from Patricia Hendricks. It was a cashier's check for $12,000, the last of what she owed from the civil judgment. Marcus had negotiated a payment plan after her house sale, and she had apparently managed to scrape together the rest. I deposited the check and sent half of it to Marcus as a bonus on top of his original fee. He protested, but I insisted. "You saved my distillery," I told him. "You are getting a piece of that." With the legal saga finally completely over, I could focus entirely on the distillery and the whiskey itself. I had started experimenting with rye whiskey, which required different techniques than bourbon. The rye was spicier, more complex, and demanded careful temperature control during fermentation. My first batch of rye came out in March 2027, and it was rough, not undrinkable, but not up to my standards. I adjusted the recipe, tweaked the distillation temperatures, and tried again. The second batch was better. The third batch was excellent. I entered the rye in the Tennessee State Spirits Competition in April 2027 and took second place in the rye category. The first place winner was a major distillery with industrial equipment and a full-time staff. Taking second against that kind of competition felt like a victory. The distillery became a fixture in the neighborhood. People would drive by slowly, pointing out the still visible through the windows, telling their passengers the story of the HOA battle. Some would stop and ask for tours, which I usually gave if I had time. It became a point of pride for Pleasant Ridge, the little distillery that refused to be shut down. In June 2027, a documentary filmmaker contacted me. She was making a film about HOA abuses across America and wanted to feature my story. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to relive the trauma, but she convinced me that the story needed to be told. People need to understand that HOAs can be dangerous, she said during our first phone call. They need to see what happens when these organizations have unchecked power. Your story shows both the problem and the solution. I agreed to participate, and she came out in July with a small crew. We filmed interviews, toured the distillery, and reenacted some key moments using photos and documents from the trial. The filmmaker, whose name was Rachel, was professional and respectful throughout the process. "This is going to be the centerpiece of the documentary," Rachel said as we wrapped filming. "The guy who stood up to the HOA and won with the state backing him up. It is a perfect narrative arc." "When will it be finished?" I asked. "Probably early next year," Rachel said. "We are filming a few more stories, then editing. But yours is the strongest one we have." The documentary aired on a streaming platform in February 2028, more than 3 years after the original demolition. It was titled Covenant: The Dark Side of HOAs, and my segment took up nearly a third of the runtime. The response was overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, other HOA victims seeking advice, and even a few distillery owners who wanted to thank me for standing up to the system. The local liquor store that carried my products called to say they had sold out immediately and needed more inventory. "We have people coming in asking specifically for the HOA whiskey," the store owner said, laughing. "That's what they're calling it now, the HOA whiskey." I ramped up production as much as I could without exceeding my permits. The increased demand meant I was finally hitting my 500-gallon annual limit, which the state was happy about since it meant more tax revenue. Even with the 5-year exemption Agent Kincaid had arranged, I was producing at a rate that would generate significant taxes once the exemption expired. In March 2028, I received an invitation to speak at a national distillers conference in Louisville, Kentucky. The organizers wanted me to talk about navigating regulatory challenges and dealing with local opposition. I accepted, though public speaking had never been my strength. The conference was in May, and I drove up to Louisville nervous but prepared. The room was packed with maybe 200 people, mostly small distillery owners and aspiring craft distillers. I stood at the podium, looked out at the crowd, and started talking. I told them the whole story, from Patricia's first violation notice to the demolition, to the trials, to the state's support. I talked about the importance of following regulations, maintaining good records, and standing up for yourself when someone tries to shut you down illegally. "The system worked for me," I said in conclusion, "because I worked within the system. I had every permit, every license, every piece of paper in order. When Patricia destroyed my distillery, I had documentation proving she was wrong and I was right. That documentation saved me. Without it, I would have been just another guy complaining about the HOA." The applause was genuine and sustained. Afterward, at least 30 people came up to ask questions, share their own stories, or just shake my hand. One older gentleman, who ran a small distillery in Georgia, had tears in his eyes. "You give us hope," he said. "I've been fighting my county for 3 years over zoning issues. They keep moving the goalposts, changing the rules. But hearing your story makes me think it is worth continuing the fight." "Document everything," I told him. "Every conversation, every decision, every permit application. The more documentation you have, the harder it is for them to claim you are doing something wrong." By the summer of 2028, nearly 4 years after the demolition, the distillery was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. I was producing at capacity, selling everything I made, and even had a waiting list for my award-winning bourbon. The tasting events were booked months in advance, and I had to turn away more requests than I accepted. Mr. Patterson passed away in August 2028, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87. The funeral was well attended, and I gave a brief eulogy about how he had stood by me during the darkest days of the HOA battle. His testimony at the civil trial had been crucial, and I made sure everyone at the funeral knew what kind of man he had been. I poured a glass of my bourbon at his graveside after everyone else had left, setting it on the ground next to the fresh earth. "Thank you for everything," I said quietly. "I could not have won without you." The house next to mine, Mr. Patterson's old place, sold quickly to a young couple with 2 kids. They were excited about the neighborhood, and completely unfazed by having a distillery next door. The husband, whose name was David, came over a few days after moving in. "So you were the famous HOA guy," David said, shaking my hand. "My wife and I watched that documentary. Pretty crazy story." "It was a crazy time," I agreed. "But it is over now. Neighborhood is quiet these days." "Good to hear," David said. "We were worried about buying in an HOA subdivision, but our realtor said this one is dormant." "Completely dead," I confirmed. "Nobody wants to revive it after what happened." In September 2028, the Tennessee Department of Revenue invited me to speak at a tax policy conference in Nashville. They wanted me to talk about the importance of license compliance from the taxpayer perspective. It was a room full of bureaucrats and policy wonks, not exactly my usual audience, but I gave it my best shot. "I am not a tax expert," I started. "I am just a guy who makes whiskey and pays his taxes. But I can tell you that when the state stepped in to defend my operation, it sent a message that compliance matters. That doing things the right way is not just about avoiding penalties. It is about earning the protection of the system." Agent Kincaid was in the audience and came up afterward. "That was perfect," she said. "You articulated exactly why we took your case seriously. You earned our support by doing everything right." "I appreciate everything you did," I said. "The reimbursement, the tax exemption, all of it. You saved my distillery." "You saved your distillery," Agent Kincaid corrected. "We just helped you rebuild. But you are the one who fought for it, who refused to let an out-of-control HOA shut you down. That took courage." The 5-year tax exemption would expire in 2029, which meant I would start paying full excise taxes again. I was fine with that. The exemption had given me breathing room to rebuild and expand, and now the distillery was profitable enough to handle the tax burden. In December 2028, I bottled a special batch to commemorate the 4th anniversary of the demolition. It was a small run, just 50 bottles, using a recipe I had been developing for months. The label featured a stylized image of a copper, still with the words "Resilience Bourbon" underneath. I gave bottles to everyone who had helped during the fight. Marcus Fleming, Agent Kincaid, the neighbors who had testified, the reporter who had covered the story fairly. Each bottle came with a handwritten note thanking them for their support. Marcus called after receiving his bottle. "This is too much, Connor. You already paid me well for my work." "That was for the legal work," I said. "This is for the friendship. You believed in me when I was at my lowest point. That is worth more than money." As 2029 began, the distillery entered its 5th year of operation since the rebuild. Production was steady, quality remained high, and the business was sustainable. I had achieved everything I had set out to do when I first got my federal distilling permit back in 2022. The story of the HOA battle faded gradually from public attention, though it remained a point of pride in Pleasant Ridge. New residents moving into the subdivision always heard about it eventually, usually from David next door, who loved telling people about his neighbor who had fought the HOA and won. In March 2029, Patricia Hendricks's probation officially ended. I received a notice from the court informing me that she had completed all requirements of her sentence. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. The whole saga had consumed 4 years of my life, and I was ready to let it go. I never saw or heard from Patricia again. According to Marcus, who kept tabs on such things, she was living quietly in Florida and staying far away from any HOA involvement. The felony conviction would follow her forever, a permanent reminder of what happens when you abuse power. The final piece of closure came in May 2029, when the Tennessee state legislature passed a new law specifically addressing HOA authority. The bill, which became known informally as the Ashford Act, though my name appeared nowhere in the text, explicitly prohibited HOAs from interfering with federally licensed business operations. It also required HOAs to obtain court orders before taking any enforcement action involving destruction of property. A legislative aide called to tell me about the bill's passage. "Your case was cited extensively during the committee hearings," she said. "Lawmakers were shocked that an HOA could demolish a federally licensed business without consequences." "There were consequences eventually," I pointed out. "Eventually, yes. But this law makes sure it cannot happen in the first place. No more Patricia Hendricks situations." I felt a strange sense of accomplishment hearing that. The fight had not just saved my distillery, it had changed the law to protect others. That mattered more than any monetary judgment or criminal conviction. In June 2029, I celebrated the 5-year anniversary of the rebuild with a special tasting event. 50 people attended, the largest group I had ever hosted. We sampled whiskeys from every year of operation, comparing how the recipes and techniques had evolved. "This one," a guest said, holding up the 2024 batch, my first after rebuilding. "You can taste the anger in this one." Everyone laughed, but there was truth to it. That batch had been made while I was still furious about the demolition, still fighting through the trials. The whiskey reflected that energy, sharp and aggressive. "And this one," another guest said, sampling the 2029 batch, "this one is peaceful." That was true too. The current production reflected where I was mentally, calm and settled. The fight was over, the distillery was secure, and I could focus entirely on the craft. As the sun set on that June evening, I stood in my backyard looking at the distillery I had built twice. The copper still gleamed in the fading light, the fermentation tanks hummed quietly, and the aging barrels sat in neat rows in the climate-controlled shed. Everything was exactly as it should be. Patricia Hendricks had tried to destroy this operation because she did not like how it looked. She had used her HOA authority to bulldoze my equipment, thinking she could get away with it. But she had miscalculated badly. She had not counted on the federal licensing laws that protected my operation. She had not anticipated the state revenue department taking my side. And she had not expected me to fight back with every legal tool available. In the end, justice had prevailed. The system had worked. The HOA president, who thought she was above the law, had faced criminal charges, civil liability, and permanent consequences. And the licensed distiller, who had done everything by the book, had received not just compensation, but active support from the state government. I poured myself a glass of the Resilience bourbon and raised it toward the still. "To fighting the good fight," I said quietly, "and to winning." The whiskey tasted smooth and perfect, 4 years of careful aging having mellowed the initial fire into something complex and satisfying. I sipped it slowly, savoring the flavors and the hard-won peace that came with it. Tomorrow I would start a new batch, continuing the cycle that defined my hobby and my passion. But tonight, I would simply enjoy what I had built, and the knowledge that no HOA would ever take it away from me again.